Okay, I'm going to start the final session now. Everything is dry, it's dried overnight. So I'm going to really look at the painting as a whole now and start with a glaze. So I need some warm colours, orange, yellows, burnt sienna. And I'm going to try and mix a colour that's watered down quite a lot with odorless paint thinners and also paint in medium. The medium's there to stop it being too runny. And I'm going to look for unifying the whole painting now. So I'm looking at glazes to warm areas up. I'm working on the belly fur here. And it's just a case of scrubbing it over the underpainting and the details really. So I'm just looking at my reference, looking across at the painting, thinking about where the light direction is coming from, and just looking for what areas really need to be brought to completion now. So I'm just going to adjust my mixes and I'll dip into this pool of paint. You can see how clear and transparent it really is. I don't want any of the detail really to be blurred out or obliterated at this stage now. So I'll just start working over the whole of the canvas. I'll work on the body, I'll jump to the head, and then I'm going to start to darken up the areas that need darkening to the final level of darkness, and then I'll start to really pop out some of the very final highlights before I finish off that mossy rock on the foreground. Put in the whiskers, which a lot of people find difficult, so I'm going to zoom right in on the whiskers, and finally I'll show you how I actually sign my name as well, which people also seem to find quite difficult. These glazes are really giving the cat its final shape and really showing out the contours as well. I'm still brushing in the direction of the fur growth most of the time, just so that if the glaze actually leaves an edge to it rather than just a perfect blend, the edge is actually going in the right direction of the fur. The good thing about having the painting dry underneath is if I find an area is not the right colour when I'm glazing it now, then I can always just take some kitchen tissue and just wipe it off and start again. I usually kind of creep up on the darker areas. I put on a glaze and then I'll make it a bit darker and then a bit darker again, rather than going straight in with the full darkness. That's allowing me to assess the areas I'm continuing to paint. Just darkening that top edge there, which will allow it to look a lot softer, making the cat become one more with the background rather than a cut-out image. Here you can see I'm starting to re-establish those final darks on the markings. Just looking at my computer screen to the left of me now, just looking at the area, zooming in, just looking for final details and final colours and things like that. Normally at this stage, if I wasn't videoing it, I would be stepping back from the canvas quite a lot as well, looking at the canvas more from the viewer's natural distance, which would probably be a minimum of probably 7 to 10 feet, and really seeing what details need to be added, because lots of the finer details, they just disappear at 7 to 10 feet, so there's no real need to get obsessed with detailing too much. Just mixed up quite an opaque paint. I want to add a little bit of a stronger contrast to this side of the face. It's really a little bit of backlighting coming in, or edge lighting. Just softening that edge where the highlight is now hitting the darker, warmer fur. it's gone a bit green from the where the background blended in the previous stage, so I'll just bring the warmth back out in that area. Just going to start to look at those real bright highlights as well now. It's just looking at the whole canvas really, and I'll flitter around from one area to another. I'm really dragging out those individual hairs now from the under texture, so I've not had to paint every single hair to get this effect. I only need to put in the main ones really now, just here and there. And of course, as I put in those very bright highlights, it's really pushing that background back even further now. You can see I'm loading the rigger brush with a real sharp chiseled edge again, as I did in previous stages. And that helps me get a real defined stroke that lasts more than one stroke as well. I can do quite a few strokes with a chiseled edge. If I didn't have that chiseled edge on there, I would only probably get 1 or 2 strokes before I had to reload the brush again. I'm trying to keep the paint quite thick as well now to add a new element of texture. it's much more natural for me to actually be pulling the brushstroke because I'm right-handed. So normally if I'm not videoing and things like that, I would turn the canvas or even just get up out of my chair and position myself so that I can pull the brushstroke as I'm doing here. Don't be afraid to actually move the canvas to suit yourself, particularly when you're doing things like whiskers or real long hairs. Makes it much easier to be pulling the brushstroke at a natural angle for yourself. Just using my finger again to remove a little bit of the paint just to make it more of a subtle mark. Now I'm really going to punch the highlights up on the chin area. It's just thicker paint now, really. Assessing the painting as well. I don't want to overwork it at this stage. Okay, I've just switched to a finer brush. At some point I'm going to have to work on darkening the eye area as well. I think the darks really need to be punched up there. Perhaps add a bit more shadow over the eye. The main area to really work up is going to be the mossy rock in the foreground. I'm mixing up quite a pinky colour now, pink and orange. So that's alizarin crimson, cadmium orange, a little bit of the browns in there to subdue it. I'm going to try and add a little bit more shape and form to the nose. That's looking much better now. It's got much more shape and form. I still want to keep that orangey, salmony colour to it because of that side lighting and things like that. It is really quite a vibrant appearance to the Snow Leopard's actual fleshy nose area. Just washed the brush out there, and you can see that's one of only a very few times you've actually seen me wash a brush during this whole 8-hour demonstration. I'm mixing up a real dark now. Just want to start re-establishing those very darks, and you see how areas will really start to pop once again. I don't want to overdo it. I still want to keep a very subtle look to the painting and keep it looking quite realistic, but areas where I've blended over and things like that have lost their punch, so I'm just re-establishing that that punch to the areas, that real high contrast. So that left eye of the cat looks a lot punchier, a lot more contrasty than the right. Just adjusting the shape of the eye, it was a little bit off there, so I've just come in a little bit over the previous painting area. Just darken that pupil, just match them up together. Yep, that looks about right. Just wiping my brush, just getting the excess paint off there, just so I can blend those edges. A mistake artists often make is to make this area around the eye very sharp edged, but always remember that the eye is actually a ball, and so the edge is almost always quite blurry. Just where the eyeball is turning, the angle is turning at the bottom. It's always a subtle change in contrast there. And remember, things are looking a little bit out of shape. You can see the edge of the canvas just because of the angle I've had to position the cameras at, so that you could get as wide a view of actually everything that I'm painting here. So you see at the end I'll show a proper still image of the painting completed, and it'll all be squared up and at the correct angle, so you'll see how things look slightly different shape there. Just going to zoom right in now just to show you exactly how I paint whiskers. This is an area that lots of people seem to struggle with. The secret is get a nice thin paint. It mustn't be too watery, and be confident with the strokes as well. See the chisel edge quite clearly there on the brush. That's allowing me to load more paint and keep a really fine edge. And there I can go back over it again as long as you're careful. Whiskers are very opaque, so you want to make this paint as thick as you can get away with it without it not flowing from the brush. It's really, you really got to go by feel on this. There, you see that mark didn't even come off the brush hardly at all. So just reloaded it. And whiskers go in all different directions, so try not to keep them uniform. Try to give a bit of variety there. I'm just dapping with my finger the area where the whisker goes into the muzzle area. I don't want it too stark and too contrasty there. And of course the left side of the cat's face, the right as we're looking at it, that needs that warmth in the colour as well, so I just put a bit of orange in there, otherwise it would have been very, very stark. You can see how the paint is coming from the brush. You've really got to get it in that direction. Make sure you pull the brush firmly, and you've got to be quite confident with the strokes. If you're very unconfident, allow the painting to dry before you put the whiskers in, and you can always add a little bit of medium to a bit of kitchen tissue and wipe them off if you're not happy. But that underpainting would need to be fully dried overnight if you're using alkyd oils as I am, or if you're using standard oils. You could be looking at a good week until it dries. Just re-establishing a few of the darker areas, also putting in a couple of small dark whiskers as well. Just here and there, just a couple of very fine ones. If you don't like an area, or if you want to subdue it, I just dab it with my finger. I don't want things to be too stark. You can see I'm not particularly happy with that whisker, so just a little bit of kitchen tissue, just dab it, and that takes a lot of the paint off and just subdues the area. If it doesn't come off enough, as long as you haven't got wet paint underneath, just a little bit of paint in medium or a little bit of thinners, and that comes straight away. Yeah, I've just re-established the darks and then overlapped it with some highlight again, just to push those darks back, just to give them that three-dimensional furry look. Really putting in those very final highlights now. This is the whitest whites, almost pure white going in. And these are the areas that really bring up the punch in the paint, and it's because this chin area is so white, you can see the area underneath the chin is automatically pushed back. Just a few highlights here and there can really make a big difference at this stage, but I don't want to overdo it too much. Just working on a couple of other areas just around the face, just around the head area. I don't want too many very strong highlights away from the centre of interest. So just here and there. Right, let's make up a nice vibrant green and start to get a bit of texture on that grassy, mossy rock in the foreground. That's the only real area now that I want to bring up to completion. Everywhere else is pretty much done. Putting a little bit of the warmth in the colour as well. I'm not quite sure where I'm going to go with this. I'm just going to create a mossy texture from a few reference photos I found, and see how realistic I can get it to look with as few brush strokes really as possible. I want all the detail really to be around the face, so I'm just going to make a suggestion here of a textured moss, adding a little bit more of the greens and colours like that, just so that I haven't got to mix everything myself, just to give me a nice base to start with. And I'll make a couple of tones here just so that I can dip into either, just so that everything has got a little bit of variety in it, even the mossy rock. Okay, let's try out a few strokes and see how it goes. I think I may need to actually put a much darker base on there so that brush strokes show up a little bit better. Surprising sometimes how you think you've gone dark enough, but very often you need to go much darker for these highlight and mid-tones to really show up as you'd want. Just going a little bit darker again, just to give a more of a rounded form to the rock. Putting it into a shadow as well, and also creating variety on the surface. You can see my brush strokes are generally going in the direction I think that the moss and the grasses and things would actually be growing in. Very similar to a fur painting technique. Just going to start to put the highlights on now. That should bring the area to life quite a lot more. I've got the dark underpaint in there now. I think I've gone dark enough, so the secret with this section now is not to overwork it. I don't want to be putting in every blade of grass and making this too much of a focal interest. But enough needs to be in there to almost match up with the cat's fur, especially on the leg and feet, because they're at the same plane really. They're at the same level in the painting, so they should almost have the same detail. I can subdue this area of rock a little bit more, but if I go too far subdued, it's just going to look unnatural compared to the leg and compared to the foot. So I'm going to quietly and slowly put in a bit of detail and assess it all the time until I can get to a point where I can sit back a little bit and say, yep, that's enough. And then I'm going to try and stop there and not get too carried away with this section. The paint is quite thick. I've just added a little bit of thinners or medium or something like that, enough only for it to stick to the canvas. If I can get away with just straight paint, I will at this stage, just to add another element of texture. It's important not to get carried away and put these lighter tones over the whole area. If I don't allow some of the darks to show through in between the brush strokes, just like on the fur, then it'll just turn into one single block of colour, which will look completely unnatural. So it's always wise to leave as much as required in between the brush strokes. just lightening the mix all the time really. I'm being careful not to add white or a lot of white at all to this mix. I wanna stop it from looking too milky and pasty, so I'm adding a lot of yellow to really punch this area up and give the same lighting effect that's on the cat. So I think this area is not far off completion now really. It's starting to look textured enough for me. Just a few more highlights here, just to make a separation between the layers. Bringing some areas forward, pushing other areas back. Even less highlights on the left hand side of the canvas. I want to keep that area quite subdued, quite subtle. I hope you found this video interesting. I don't think there's many, if any, artists out there that have actually shown a full length painting in real time, showing the palette so you can see all the mixing of the paints and the application of the paints and everything as well. If you bought the full length version, I hope it hasn't been too tedious to you, sitting through 8 hours of painting. Right, I'm just gonna do the signature now. The paint needs to be quite watery. If it's not watery, it's not going to flow from the canvas, so from the brush onto the canvas, sorry. And I keep my signature very simple. I'm using a similar colour to the grass. I don't want it to really be a focal point. If I did a red or something like that, it would be a real focal point now. So there you go, that's the signature, just to finish off the painting.